We're now sitting here with Joseph Tanke. How did you arrive into aesthetics and what did you first work on?
Well, I first arrived at aesthetics sort of indirectly. My academic interests were always social and political philosophy. In particular, my pathway to philosophy was through Marx and Marxism and critical theory, where aesthetics plays a central role. And I was predominantly interested in ethical and political questions. And I had several mentors along the way who had the good sense to notice that I was always talking to them about problems with contemporary art, my interest in music, interest in film. And so I would say this was always clicking away in the background. And in reflecting on your question, I think that my pathway to aesthetics comes from music. This was the first art form that spoke to me and spoke to me in a powerful way.
Oh, that's interesting.
I had the good fortune to grow up in Cleveland, Ohio during the mid to late 90s, where there was a flourishing underground music scene.
Right.
And so my pathway to aesthetics is maybe a little bit unconventional in that it was through hardcore punk rock music, noise, extreme metal, experimental rock that first spoke to me, and I didn't at the time have the language to conceptualize it. But this was what was always kind of igniting the fire and was fueling my creativity. And so it was in graduate school that my mentors began to say, well, aesthetics is an sort of underdeveloped area of philosophy, particularly in the North American context. It's still fighting. We're still fighting to try to get it integrated into philosophy departments. It's one of the last areas I think that philosophy departments today think to hire in. More and more, So it's worth saying that aesthetics is a very broad discursive umbrella in which people come from art history, people come from literary studies, people come from urban studies, but I came to it through philosophy, right? And so I was interested in the discourse of philosophical aesthetics. And I would say it took me a long time to sort of figure out what the story was there. I could never understand, what were the key problems and what were the animating questions. And so, and I will say, I operate with a distinction between aesthetics and the philosophy of art too. Like in the North American context, I think that distinction is pretty important for us because the pursuit of the philosophy of art is a more analytic, an enterprise that has more affinity in the tradition of Anglo-analytic philosophy, whereas I was trained in continental philosophy. And so references like Baumgarten, Kant, Schiller, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, these were for me what the tradition of aesthetics was about. And that was my pathway to it. Learning, so to sum up, learning how to reconcile like this personal interest I had in contemporary visual art, underground music, and then my own academic training. Aesthetics for me provided a way to join these together and synthesize them. And then I should say I had the good fortune in my first academic appointment was at California College of the Arts in San Francisco. Right. And so I had this wonderful opportunity to teach aesthetics to art students.
Yeah, that's great.
And to try to show them why and how this could be useful, right? Is it Barnett Newman who famously says, aesthetics is to artists what ornithology is to birds, right? But I think, my years there proved this to be wrong and refuted this, right? That aesthetics was a way of developing a language that they could use to justify their way of knowing and experiencing the world.
Oh, that's incredible. Just a small rebound question.
Yeah, please.
Saito said it was very useful to teach art students. Did it change your thinking about aesthetics?
Teaching art students. That's a great question. And I'm sure it did. One of the things, I don't know if it changed the way I think about aesthetics, but it changed the way I approach aesthetics. And so teaching art students who were completely unmotivated by grades, or what is considered to be, proper academic formation, you had to demonstrate continually the utility of what you were offering to them. But what teaching these art students really gave me was this idea that I should not just be a guy who comments on texts, like so many people in philosophy are. They wanted to know, okay, you're a philosopher, where do you stand on these things? They were very interested. And so I think it forced me to adopt my own voice earlier than I would have had I been in a more traditional philosophy department where, they would say, how many articles have you published on Kant's Third Critique and these kinds of questions. So
that's great. That's a good one.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And coming back for a moment for this relationship between aesthetics and philosophy, of which you have intensively written and published also. So how would you define this this relationship or this connection between the two? So how would you explain this?
So my way of thinking about it is that when we're talking about Western philosophy, we have 5 main branches of philosophy, and aesthetics is sort of latecomer to the game, right? It's an 18th century discipline or branch of philosophy that takes its name from Baumgarten's Aesthetica in 1750. Of course, the term has some currency earlier than that, but it's really around this time that people begin to talk about aesthetics as a science of sensible cognition, or aesthetics as a form of judgment. So I see aesthetics as a latecomer to philosophy, which is not to say that questions of beauty and questions of sense perception were absent from earlier, from the history of philosophy earlier. Just that we name it and formalize it a little bit later. And in many ways, particularly in the continental tradition, it's the place where a lot of other philosophical problems are pushed off, and come to the fore. How is it that we the Kantian problem? How is it that we can justify a universal voice as when we articulate something as beautiful or sublime? We speak as though it's an inherent property of the object, and even though it relies on our own feeling or our own intuition about the matter, these problems of sensation, of feeling, of emotion, which have been, I think, shunted off and rendered peripheral for much of the history of philosophy, really come to the surface in aesthetics, and that's where we have to confront them head on. So I think a large part of what we do, and speaking, someone in philosophy, is to get people to take this enterprise seriously. I mentioned earlier that a large part of my problem consists of trying to figure out what the story is of aesthetics. How do all these different texts hang together? How are these thinkers responding to one another, if at all? So one of the things I'm proud of in my academic career is an anthology that I edited with my friend and colleague Colin McQuillan. We did the Bloomsbury Anthology of Aesthetics, which was really our attempt to kind of talk back to our academic formation, but then also to sort of solidify this story of what's really going on in aesthetics. And so one of the things that I see it as about the creation of a specific form of experience, which is not reducible to concepts like perfection or proportion, or the interests we have in truth, morality, or utility. Right? My picture of aesthetics is very heavily inflected by Kant, and I think the Third Critique is an endless source of inspiration. A book I never tire of teaching, a book I never tire of reading. Speaking of my art students, one of the most interesting things that one of them said to me during that time was a young woman, after a really dense discussion of Kant, and the role that the imagination plays in the formation of aesthetic judgment. She came up to me after class and said, I really feel like this justifies my way of knowing the world. And I think there's something right about that. I don't know if that answers your question, but...
Oh, this is really interesting. I think that really hit the question. As you're involved in philosophy, East/West, and Hawaii is famous as a meeting point of Western and Eastern, we would be curious to hear what you think is the role of aesthetics in this relationship or meeting.
So, yes, it's a great question. I think one of the primary reasons I ended up at the University of Hawaii is that they had a really strange job advertisement for someone who could teach aesthetics, continental philosophy, and logic, right? And we don't often think of these, maybe we think of two of these going together, aesthetics and continental philosophy, or maybe even aesthetics and logic, but all three, right? They were looking for someone who would be able to do all three. And it's because there's an older discourse, and I don't know how current it is, but those who are engaged in the field of East-West comparative philosophy saw aesthetics as central to that. And so part of their argument was that Chinese and Japanese philosophy don't have the same way of... the five branches of philosophy that I was talking about, metaphysics, ethics, politics, aesthetics, are not necessarily applicable when we're talking about Chinese and Japanese philosophy, maybe more so with respect to Indian philosophy. But my department tries to cover all these areas. And the idea was that that it doesn't make sense to articulate Asian philosophy in terms of metaphysics, but as an aesthetic philosophy, right? So this is was one of the ways in which those who were predominantly engaged with Chinese philosophy conceived of their endeavor as that it was in some way engaged with the question of aesthetics. I think this is a little bit of an old-fashioned or maybe outmoded way of thinking about what comparative philosophy does. People today are tending more towards what is sometimes called a form of fusion philosophy, which tries to draw disparate elements, which kind of takes over the Anglo-analytic approach to dealing with philosophical problems, but then drawing upon different resources from different traditions to speak to those problems. But I think I have the fact that the comparative philosophy was such an established enterprise at the University of Hawaii to thank for the fact that I'm there, right? That they saw aesthetics as really central to philosophy rather than peripheral to philosophy. Whereas a lot of places where, say, the philosophy of science is more predominant are more interested in having a logician. But I started to say that this was also part of the mix at the University of Hawaii, is that we have a long history of also doing philosophy of science.
Sure.
And so logic is part of the formation that we want to give our students, and certainly our graduate students. And so it was expected, that yes, you do aesthetics, but that this can be done also, that this is compatible with serious interest in the history of science and philosophy of science. I don't feel like I'm giving a very, very good answer to this question, in part because I hesitate to say whether or not that I myself do comparative philosophy. I would like to say that I do comparative philosophy. Since moving to the University of Hawaii, I certainly read a lot more broadly. I've grown incredibly interested in Chinese and Japanese philosophy and Indian philosophy. I think will also be part of that picture. But I don't have any Asian languages. I don't read Japanese or Chinese. So to say that I really do it, I think would be misleading. But I think it's a very important orientation for philosophy to have. Particularly in the 21st century, that more. I'll just say I think more philosophy departments should look like the University of Hawaii, where we tried to understand philosophy very pluralistically.
Sure.
One of my colleagues, when I was considering the move, said this to me, and this gives me some encouragement and some hope that whether or not you ever take up the project of comparative philosophy explicitly or not, you'll already be doing it from the standpoint of our students, because they come here for this interest in Eastern philosophy, and so to be providing a background in continental philosophy for them will accomplish part of that mission. So I'd like to think of myself as in dialogue with this project very seriously.
Oh, it's great.
Yeah, and continuing along these lines regarding your career and academic activities, that for years you run a great series on contemporary aesthetics at Rowman and Littlefield. And what do you think, how is the role and importance of these specialized book series compared to the individual volumes? So what is the surplus that they might have?
One of the things I wanted to do with that book series, since moving to Hawaii, I was traveling quite a lot and getting to do aesthetics in a lot of different contexts, teaching in China, going for conferences in Korea, in Latin America, and of course in Europe. And it seemed to me that there was no platform for thinking about aesthetics in the sense of world philosophy, or in terms of a globalized conversation. And so that was something I hoped to do, was to provide a platform for scholars from outside of North America to publish and be part of this discourse. So the series was able to publish books taking up very traditional questions in the philosophy of art, from the Anglo-analytic orientation, contributions to history of philosophy. One of the things I'm proud of is a book that my friend and colleague edited on Baumgarten's aesthetics, right? Who's so underexplored because his major work still exists in Latin. The incredibly ambitious book that you both edited for the series. So I really wanted it to be a place where we could take aesthetics in a broad, global sense, and see how people are relating to this idiom from different contexts. I should say that speaking to the question of East-West comparative philosophy, that I still think whether or not we think of aesthetics as central to that to the conversation in philosophy, I think that in some ways it's the most obvious starting point for a comparison or a dialogue between cultures, right? How do they relate? How do they represent themselves visually? Or how do they relate themselves to the senses, right? What's considered beautiful in a certain context? What does that say about the broader culture, right? I think that particularly too often in philosophy, and I'm here speaking for myself, we grab things by the wrong end. We grab things, in an idealist fashion. Whereas aesthetics is the reminder to return to the body, return to the senses, return to what's most evident, and that this can become the starting point for a dialogue between cultures.
Oh, that was incredibly good. You have worked on the aesthetics of Michel Foucault also, which is maybe a bit of a novelty for many, I think. What kind of an aesthetics did Foucault have beyond the care of the self, which is of course also an aesthetics?
So it's a fair question whether or not Foucault's writings on art constitute aesthetics in the classical sense. It would depend on what we mean by that. But that's my first book is called Foucault's Philosophy of Art, A Genealogy of Modernity. I think I wanted to do two primary things in there. The first was just to look at Foucault's writings on art, which had up until that point been somewhat scattered across the corpus. There was the sense that the essay he wrote on Magritte was important, but nobody could really figure out why. There was the sense that the things he has to say about Las Meninas at the beginning of the Order of Things is important, but what exactly is going on there is in many ways still a mystery. And so I wanted to look at all, and of course there are other things that are even more tangential and less explored. But I wanted to try to look at these writings on visual art together and see if there was a coherent vision there, if Foucault had a consistent set of concerns and questions. And it's probably not surprising to say that he did, and that question is probably the question which animated most of his writing, or most of his thinking, which is, what is the nature of our modernity, and how is it different from what came before? And so this consisted of trying to think about what content we could give to a concept of modern art, and could it be, and Foucault's sense is that it is in many ways a rupture with classical modes of representation. So the other major thing I wanted to do in the book was to sort of redeem one of the promises he made in The Archaeology of Knowledge, where he talks about the extension of this archaeological method that he develops in his early writings. He talks about extending it to the field of painting. Yeah. And so I wanted to say to try to think about what would this methodology look like as a way of approaching artistic discourse. What kind of sets of questions does it give rise to? How does it allow us to see? What does it allow us to say about painting that would be different? And so it's not surprising to say that there's a real sensitivity to historical differences and historical ruptures in Foucault, and that we see this throughout his concerns with visual art. And then, of course, aesthetics becomes quite central in the later Foucault, but in a different sense that you're alluding to, when he's talking about an aesthetics of existence and a care of the self. The more I think about that stuff, the more I really see that as really quite essential for understanding who the man was as a person, and what he was aspiring to do. I think Foucault's work is animated by the question that, or the intuition that it's very strange that we turn so many domains of human life into areas that are ruled or governed by scientific discourses, right? This is maybe too simple of a way of summing up the history of sexuality project, but Foucault thinks it's very strange that we try to regulate this mode of our lives by means of a discourse that purports to be scientific. One of the things he says very early in his career in the 1960s is that the critique of the accumulation of knowledge is just as important as the critique of the accumulation of capital. And this is because he already has the intuition that knowledge is structured by power, and that it gives rise to, that it forecloses upon certain ways of life and gives rise to certain other ways which may be problematic. And so his invocation of aesthetics towards the end of his life, I think, is a way of trying to hold on to this space that his genealogy is clear. And what I mean by that is saying, if we're not going to govern our lives by means of a discourse which purports to be scientific, and the kinds of norms, heavy norms that comes with it, that doesn't mean that it's going to be purely anarchical and purely haphazard, but that it can be regulated by means of an art, right? And so I think in this way he's when he's talking about an aesthetics of an existence, he's in some way exploiting the Kantian sense that aesthetic experience is a form of experience that's rule-like, but nevertheless not reducible to a rule, that's not governed by concepts of truth, of utility, or of morality, but nevertheless have a rule-like structure to them, which is a way of stylizing one's freedom at the end of the day for Foucault. And so this is how I've come to see this sort of holistically in his work and the place of aesthetics.
Oh, that was really interesting. I suppose we could have to say just thank you for this fantastic chat, right?
Absolutely, thank you, and
Thank you both.